We are
This
here today.
conference will now be recorded.
We are here today for a public information session to discuss whether the village and town should allow cannabis dispensaries and/or on-site consumption lounges. Keep in mind, this is not a discussion on if cannabis should be legal. That decision was made in New York State on March 31st. Our discussion today has two parts. The first part will be a presentation by Sarah Brancatella, followed by a chance to ask questions of her. The second part of our meeting will be a place to have public comments. Sarah's time is limited due to a prior commitment, so please use the first half hour of the meeting to ask questions of her and the second half for public comment. And Jay, if you would like to introduce Sarah.
Yes, thank you, Art. We're very pleased to welcome Councilor Sarah Brancatella, who has volunteered her time to be our guest speaker as an authority on the new Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act. Sarah has been with the Association of Towns for almost 10 years and is the legislative director in charge of the organization's advocacy efforts, where she was very involved in following and analyzing various versions of cannabis legislation. And she is one of 3 attorneys on the staff that helps train and educate town officials. We are most appreciative of the town official guide to cannabis that Sarah is responsible for writing. She's a graduate of SUNY Geneseo and got her master's and law degrees from the University at Buffalo. Please reserve all questions and input until the presentation is completed. A 2-minute window will be given to each person who would like to speak on this subject following the presentation. I will now turn the program over to Councilor Brancatella. And again, Sarah, thank you for sharing your time and knowledge on the Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act.
Well, thanks for having me. Can you guys hear me all right?
We can hear you great.
Okay, perfect. Before I get started on today's presentation, I'm just going to go over a few housekeeping matters. Number one, I have cats who are currently running around. This is their power hour. I hope that it's still charming and whimsical to have animals appear on screen, because that might happen. Also, if I say towns, that's just the currency that I deal in, but I'm using towns as an omnibus term referring to both the town and the village, unless I note otherwise. But I just tend to slip into a habit of referring to every municipality as a town. Makes sense, I'm with the Association of Towns. But when I say town, for the most part, I mean town and village, unless I specifically designate a difference between the authority of the town and the authority of the village. The other thing that I would just mention is that I don't have any agenda on what the town and village decides to do with this. I am here strictly as an informational resource, and I wholly, completely, 100% defer to your elected officials. As a home rule organization, we strongly believe that those who are elected in local office know what's best for your community. So I don't really have a horse in this race as far as if the village or town should legalize, if they shouldn't opt out, what their options are. I'm really just here to provide information, and I completely defer to what your elected officials decide to do. So with that, let's get into the Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act. If you don't understand something, it's not, I haven't explained it well enough. So please feel free to ask me to re-explain something if I'm not clear. But the Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act is this huge, sprawling piece of legislation that legalizes adult use cannabis and touches on a number of different things. It creates an entirely new area of law, cannabis law, that regulates basically 3 different sub-elements. Adult use cannabis, that's what we think of as recreational pot. Cannabis, which had already been legalized in New York State, but it creates an entirely different regulatory scheme, and hemp/cannabinoid hemp, aka CBD oil. I have adult use cannabis in red because that is the main area where municipalities have a function. I should also mention that, MRTA is, as I mentioned before, a sprawling piece of legislation, but I'm only going to be talking about the role of local governments today. I'm not going to get into the weeds. Pun absolutely 100% intended there. I'm not going to get into the weeds on things like the labeling requirements for medical cannabis. That doesn't really have any intersection or nexus with local government, so I'm not going to be talking about that. There were significant changes to the penal code that have an impact on local government, changes to tax law, changes to public health law. So it really touches on a whole bunch of different topics. But again, today I'm going to be focused on how it relates to the role of local government and what your town and village can do. Really quickly going over the state structure. There's four, I guess, offices, central offices under the state structure. You have your Cannabis Control Board, and that's the entity that's going to be in charge of granting, revoking, limiting licensing, and draft regulations. So they're the ones who are ultimately going to approve any sort of application. You also have the Office of Cannabis Management. Their basic function is to assist the Cannabis Control Board. They're going to be the ones who actually kind of pre-review the applications. I like to think of them as the worker bees, if you will, and the Cannabis Control Board is the one that makes the ultimate determination, but the Office of Cannabis Management is going to be the one that preps everything. They also have the authority to inform inspections. They have to maintain records. They have to, in connection with the Cannabis Control Board, issue this yearly report, basically on how the state's doing with all of this. Social equity is a huge component of MRTA. That was a big concern with the sponsors of the legislation. So the Office of a State Equity Officer has been created, and they are there to help the Cannabis Control Board and the Office of Cannabis Management develop and implement social equity plans. And then the State Cannabis Advisory Board, they are there to advise and issue recommendations on medical adult use and hemp and administer community grants, which is going to be part of the equity program. I'm going to go over that very briefly at the end, just more of a, hey, just so you know, they're concerned with equity. So I mentioned that MRTA creates this entire new area of law, cannabis law. And I had also mentioned that municipalities mostly have an intersection with adult use cannabis, again, recreational pot. So that's found in Article 3 of this new cannabis law. And Article 3, let me tell you, the regulation of cannabis, it is regulated from soup to nuts, and you have to have a license at each different stage of the procedure, from cultivating to the end result of selling to the consumer. So I think under Article 3, there are actually 11 different types of licenses. I have retail dispensaries and on-site consumption in red because those are the only two where your town or village has any authority. They are expressly preempted by the state from regulating in relation to any other type of license. That means that the state has said in the legislation that your town or village cannot adopt any local laws, any regulations, any local rules on any other type of thing. Your retail dispensary, that's just a fancy way of saying your pot store where you can buy your pot. And your on-site consumption, that's a fancy way of saying, if you think of it in terms of alcohol, right, you go to the liquor store to buy your bottle of wine, you go to a bar to drink a glass of wine. So your on-site consumption site is just where it's the equivalent of a pot bar, let's say. Quickly, with regard to sales, sales can only be made to those who are 21 or older. Same with alcohol. You cannot sell to anybody who's visibly intoxicated or impaired. And the entity selling can refuse to sell if they believe that the cannabis will be distributed illegally. Not that different from your gas station that sells beer and you see a gaggle of clearly under 21-year-old kids standing on the corner while their older brother goes inside to buy some beer. Yeah, the clerk, just like that situation, the clerk can say, no, I'm not going to sell that beer to you. Same with pot, okay? So what can your town or village do with respect to these retail dispensaries, the pot store, or the on-site consumption site, the pot bars? Well, your town or your village can adopt local laws opting out of retail and on-site consumption sites. If the town adopts a local law opting out, it is only going to be applicable in that area of the town that lies outside the village. The village has the authority to make its own determination. So if the town opts out, but the village does not adopt a local law opting out, then the opt-out only applies in the area outside of the village, the town outside of the village. I know it's a lot easier for me to just say if the village opts in. technically, you don't have to opt in. That's why I'm such a stickler about saying if the village decides not to opt out, because you don't have to do anything if you want to allow establishments to operate within your jurisdiction. It's only when you don't want a retail dispensary or an on-site consumption site that you have to adopt this local law. This local law has to be adopted before December 31st, 2021, and it's subject to a permissive referendum under Municipal Home Rule Law Section 24. That means that before the law goes into effect, residents have an opportunity to submit a valid petition forcing a public vote on the issue. This is one of the significant differences between the authority of the town and the authority of the village, given this weird nuance in Municipal Home Rule Law Section 24. So a village board, your board of trustees, actually has the authority to decide that they're going to put it to a vote without waiting for a petition to be filed. So the village board can, of its own accord, decide, hey, we're going to hold a referendum on this. The town board, on the other hand, can't, of its own initiative, decide to take this to a vote of the residents. It has to wait until a petition is filed if it is going to go to a vote. And if there's no petition filed or no action taken by the village board, then there's no referendum and the local law is in effect. So what can the town or village do with retail establishments or on-site consumption sites if it does not opt out? So again, that would be you allow pot stores and pot bars to operate within your jurisdiction. Also important to keep in mind, just because you allow these things to take place in your community doesn't necessarily mean that they will. I think I don't want to prognosticate on the issue, but I think it's safer to say that there might be some interest in having some establishments in your area, given that it is, a tourist site and it draws a lot of visitors. But just because you allow it doesn't mean that it necessarily will absolutely come there. But so if you do allow these establishments within your jurisdiction, what can your town or village still do? You can adopt local laws placing time, place, manner restrictions on dispensaries and on-site consumption sites. Your local zoning laws would apply, but you would also have the authority to place additional restrictions on that, so long as they are not unreasonably impractical. So what do I mean by that? I mean, you could not adopt a local law saying that retail dispensaries can only operate between the hours of 5 a.m. and 6 a.m. That is, I'm going to take a guess and say that the Cannabis Control Board, which would be the entity that determines if a local law is unreasonably impractical, I'm going to say that they would think that that's unreasonably impractical. But you could, for example, say cannabis establishments can only operate in industrial zones. I know that's actually a popular construct in Massachusetts, but you can restrict establishments, dispensaries, and on-site consumption sites to certain areas of the town or village if you want to. The state also has its own imposed rule that dispensaries and consumption sites cannot be within 500 feet of a school or 200 feet of a house of worship. That is consistent with what's in alcohol and beverage laws as far as liquor stores and bars. Towns and villages are otherwise preempted from regulating any other type of license or establishment. So it has no role in cultivation, processing, distributing. It's really just involved or has any sort of authority with respect to these two specific licenses, the retail dispensary and the on-site consumption. Again, if the town or village decides not to opt out, again, that's allowing these establishments to operate within your jurisdiction, they still have the opportunity to weigh in, because a retail dispensary or an on-site consumption site has to provide a notice to the municipality between 270 and 30 days before applying for a license. A retail or on-site applicant has to notify the municipality of their intention to file an application. This is going to go to the town and village clerk. And once the municipality gets that notice, they have the option to submit an opinion on whether that license should be granted or rejected. So for example, maybe the municipality feels as though enough licenses have already been granted in your area. Your town or village doesn't have the authority to limit the amount of licenses that are granted. Again, that's a decision of the Cannabis Control Board, but they do have the opportunity to weigh in and express these concerns, saying, hey, you know what, you've already granted 4 licenses. We have significant concerns. We have health and safety concerns. The town or village has an opportunity to weigh in. Or maybe you've heard, maybe bad things about a certain entity and you have concerns associated with them, that this is your opportunity for your municipality to weigh in on that. The opinion actually becomes part of the official record of the cannabis, of the official application and the official record. And the Cannabis Control Board has to respond to the municipality with an explanation of how the opinion was considered in granting or denying the application. Shifting gears away from your pot store and your pot bar. So that's what your municipalities can do with respect to those 2 things. Shifting over to personal cultivation and possession. If you are 21 and older, you can have 3 ounces of cannabis or 24 grams of concentrated cannabis on your person. You can also cultivate cannabis on your property, and individuals can have up to 3 mature plants on property, but overall a property cannot have more than 12 plants per property. So let's say that you have 6 people living in a town. Every person, each one of those 6 people wouldn't be able to have 3 plants. It's capped at 12 plants per property. Also, there's a prohibition against selling personally cultivated cannabis to any individual. That's why the state has this entire regulatory system. The state, it's just like you can't sell your moonshine that you make in your backyard. You have to get these licenses, right? And the town can take, or village can take, reasonable steps to ensure that anybody under 21 does not have access. You can investigate. You can't prohibit personal cultivation, but those who decide to personally cultivate have to take reasonable steps to ensure that those who are under 21 don't have access. And I do want to correct myself because I said that the town or village has the authority to ensure this. That's not the case. The language of the statute actually says that personal cultivators have to take reasonable steps to ensure that those under 21 do not have access. So that's what, I should have mentioned this from the very get-go. A lot of these things are in the works. It'll be interesting to see how things play out and turn out. So we'll see what's considered reasonable steps. Yeah, but personal cultivation will be allowed. Here's what I was thinking about when I meant towns and villages can enact local laws to reasonably regulate actions and conduct of personal cultivation. How that's going to play out is interesting, but just so you know, towns and villages do have the authority to make this. You cannot prohibit, the municipality cannot prohibit personal cultivation, but you can enact reasonable regulations. The violation of your local law can't exceed $200 in a civil penalty. I know that there's a lot of agita and concern about personal cultivation. It's going to be a longer time coming. Home growth is not going to be authorized until 18 months after the opening of the first adult use dispensaries. And I think the state doesn't anticipate adult use dispensaries to be up and running until the later half of 2022, like the last quarter of 2022. So, I mean, the earliest that you're going to see personal cultivation is going to be in 2024, I would say. Also, the Office of Cannabis Control Management is going to issue some regulations on personal cultivation, and I think that'll give some good guidelines and more of an idea of what municipalities can enact local laws on that reasonably regulate personal cultivation. Taxing cannabis, because taxing and fees are something to keep in the revenue. The opportunity for revenue is something that your municipality should keep in mind when evaluating whether to opt out. So in addition to all of these licensing fees, every time an applicant applies for a license, they have to pay a certain fee. There's also additional taxes that are imposed. Some taxes are based on the amount of total THC that's in a product. For lack of a better way to put it, THC is the stuff that gets you high. It's the chemical that gets you high. So some taxes are based on that. And then there's also a sales tax. The state imposes a tax. So it imposes this, you can think of it as a 4% surcharge, if you will, and towns and villages may receive a portion of this 4% surcharge tax that's imposed on sales from retail dispensaries to the consumer. Tax and Finance is going to collect the tax, this 4% surcharge, distributes it to the state controller. The state controller is going to distribute it to the county, and then the county is in charge of distributing it to any towns, cities, or villages within the county. So the way that this 4% tax is going to be distributed among municipalities, 25% of this 4% sales surcharge, let's call it, 25% of it is going to stay with the county. And then the remaining 75% pot will be distributed to towns, cities, and villages in proportion to sales from retail dispensaries and on-site consumption sites within their jurisdiction. So the example that I like to use is, let's hypothetically say that $100,000 is made from this 4% surcharge. Of that $100,000, $25,000 is going to stay with the county. The rest of that $75,000 is going to be, it depends on the amount of sales that take place. So let's say that 50%, no, let's not do that because I'm not that good at math. Let's say that 33% of all sales take place within the village of Lake Placid, 33% take place within the town of North Elba, and 33% takes place in another town. Then Lake Placid, North Elba, and the other town are all going to get $25,000. If you do not have a retail dispensary or an on-site consumption site within your town or your village, you will not get any revenue from it because there are no sales taking place within your jurisdiction. So revenue is really linked to the amount of sales that take place in your area. If a town and a village both allow retail sales, this is a weird little provision actually. So if a town and a village both allow retail sales within their jurisdiction and the dispensaries in the village, then the money is actually distributed pursuant to an agreement between the town and the village. The default is a 50-50 split if there's no agreement. But let's say that the town opts out. So let's say that the town of North Elba opts out, but the village of Lake Placid allows retail establishments to exist within their jurisdiction, then the village of Lake Placid would keep all of that revenue. But if the town of North Elba allows retail establishments and on-site consumption sites, and the village of Lake Placid also allows them, then the town and the village are going to have to work together and decide how to distribute revenue between the two of them, because otherwise the default is that the revenue is just split 50-50. However, let's say hypothetically speaking that the village of Lake Placid opts out, but the town of North Elba allows cannabis establishments to take place, then the town does not have to share with the village. I know that's getting into like the nitty gritty things. It's a little bit complicated. I will say it favors towns. It's not something that AOT advocated for, the Association of Towns advocated for. We were surprised to see this. We don't like to throw any form of local government under the bus. So we were surprised to see this, but it does actually favor towns in this circumstance. But again, if the town opts out, it won't get any revenue. But if the village but if both of them will opt in, there's a potential for sharing between the two of them. I think that is probably better explained in the manual that I created than out loud, but just so you know that provision exists. Finally, just really quickly over some last things. Where can you smoke? Smoking cannabis is prohibited where smoking not marijuana, oh my gosh, tobacco, where smoking tobacco is prohibited. So smoking is allowed in accordance with Public Health Law, Article 13E. That prohibits smoking of cannabis and, well, now cannabis and tobacco products on school properties, in bars, places like that. The town and village can also place more restrictive smoking requirements on municipally owned or controlled property like parks or sidewalks. So the town, your municipality also has authority to make some more restrictive requirements than what's allowed under Public Health Law, Article 13E. One significant difference is, you know, you can smoke a cigarette in your car, but you're not allowed to smoke pot in your car. That is, don't you guys worry about that. You're not allowed to do that. Some policing and labor issues. You can no longer use the smell of pot as a basis for reasonable suspicion unless somebody is pulled over and they're suspected of driving while impaired. Employers are barred from discriminating against cannabis users. You can still be fired or disciplined for working while impaired, and you're still subject to federal requirements. So, for example, if you have a CDL license, you're subject to periodic drug testing. Yeah, if you have a CDL license, you don't want to, and you test positive for THC, that is problematic because under federal standards, cannabis is still not allowed. Finally, truly finally, social equity programs. I mentioned before that MARTA is really heavy on social equity issues. So there's supposed to be a social equity program that's put together by the social equity officer, the Cannabis Control Board, and the Office of Cannabis Management. The idea is to prioritize applications from applicants in communities from disproportionately impacted, that were disproportionately impacted by cannabis enforcement, to promote women and minority-owned businesses, to help distressed farmers. After taking money after taking money out of the cannabis, after taking money out to run the state portion of the cannabis program, 40% of the remaining money will go into the state lottery program for grants to school districts. I don't know if you guys know this, but the state lottery actually funds a lot of education programs in New York State. So it's kind of similar to that. 20% of those remaining funds are going to go to drug treatment and public education funds, and then 40% will go to these community grants reinvestment funds. More details on these are to follow. We'll find out a lot more about how these social equity programs are going to run, but there definitely was an emphasis on sort of correcting the wrongs that existed from disproportionately enforcing cannabis laws on minority communities. So that is my elevator speech on what MRTA is. And with that, I'm just going to open up the floor to questions.
Sarah, there are 2 questions already in the chat box. Do you see those?
Yep. Okay, Sarah, clarification. If a town/village opts out, then no licenses for retail dispensaries and/or on-site consumption lounges would be granted. Yes, that is the intention of the law. If the town or village opts out, then the Cannabis Control Board should abide by that local law and not grant any licenses. Another clarification, are license revenues generated for those areas that a town/village cannot opt out of, for example, distribution or processing. The only amount of revenue that a municipality can share in relates to sales directly to the consumer. So from the on-site consumption site and the retail dispensaries. So there are fees associated with processing licenses, things like that, but the town doesn't get to share in any of them. The town or village doesn't get to share in any of that money.
Okay.
Can a town opt back in? If a municipality adopts a local law opting out, a municipality can then subsequently adopt a local law overriding your local law opting out. So essentially, by overriding your local law opting out, you're opting in. There's only one opportunity to opt out, though. You have to have this local law in place by December 31st, 2021. So let's say that your town or village board is not going to have an opportunity to opt out at a later date. And let's say that Let's say that your town has opted out. Then in 2024, they decide, hey, we're going to overturn this local law. We're going to opt in, basically. That's cool. But then there is no other opportunity to opt out again. Once you're in, you're in. It's like the Hotel California. You can check out anytime you want, but you can never leave. Clarification, if a village has a store, but the town it's in opts out, does the village have to share the revenue? Yeah, I know that I was doing a bad job, like a confusing job of explaining that. So if a village has a store and the town opts out, then the town is not able to receive any of the revenue. But if a village has a store, the town has not opted out, so they haven't adopted their local law, but no stores have opened up in the town, then that triggers that weird situation where either the revenue that's derived from the store in the village is shared 50-50 with the town, or the village board and the town board can come to an agreement on how revenue would be distributed in that situation. Could a municipality prohibit smoking in public? A municipality only has the authority to prohibit or restrict smoking on property that it has control over. So it could, yeah, I guess in general public, but let's say that there's a private park. A municipality doesn't have any authority to adopt a local law restricting smoking there. It's only on municipally owned and controlled property that they can restrict smoking.
Does anyone else have questions that they want to share, not in the chat?
Unmute themselves.
Unmute.
Yeah, you need to unmute yourself if you do.
Sarah, what rules might apply to ORDA property? I'm not gonna lie, I don't even know what ORDA property is.
Florida.
Olympic Regional Development Authority,
State property.
state.
It's state property.
Okay, state property. Well, a municipality doesn't have any jurisdiction over that. So that's really gonna be what the state decides.
Some aborted venues are on town property.
Okay. That is one of those things that's, I think that we're gonna figure that out. I know that it's not specifically addressed in MRTA. Yeah, it's definitely not specifically addressed in MRTA, that like state-owned property. Yeah. I don't have a good answer for that. I'm not ashamed to say I don't know. I'm not gonna give you a BS answer when I don't know. I know that it's not addressed in the law, so I can't answer that. I'm sorry. Sarah, would the answer be the same for schools? Well, again, you're not allowed to smoke on school property. You're not allowed to sell cannabis. Like you're not I'm trying to think how to answer this. You're already not. Public Health Law Article 13E already prohibits smoking on school property. It already prohibits sales from taking place within 500 feet of a school property. So a municipality doesn't have any jurisdiction on school property really. And it's not like the Board of Education has the authority to allow cannabis sales or smoking to take place on that property. So there's not really too much of a concern there, I guess. Are there any limits to how many stores are allowed in the town? Are there any revenue estimates being put out to help the decision making? So the Cannabis Control Board is the entity that's going to decide how many licenses are issued. There's no statutory limit currently. There might, hypothetically speaking, there might be in the regulations that come out, but really I think it's going to lie within the discretion of the Cannabis Control Board to determine how many licenses are allowed. Again, if a municipality allows these places to open within their jurisdiction, they're still going to get that notice. And if they're concerned about too many establishments being opened up, they do have the opportunity to write the Cannabis Control Board and say, hey, guys, we think that there are too many places open opening up here. And the Cannabis Control Board has to take that into account when determining whether to approve that application. What about bodies of water? Oh God, okay. Okay, so the question is, what about bodies of water? If there's a prohibition of smoking in a public park, then could somebody sit 10 feet off the water in a kayak? Bodies of water are a cluster, okay? Because it really depends on who controls the body of water, right? And who controls the body of water is, I don't know if you can see my screen, but I'm shaking my head because that can be particularly confusing. I don't specifically know about Mirror Lake or Lake Placid, what the entity is that owns the underlying riparian rights and stuff like that. You know, if it's this, generally the rule is if it's state-owned property, a municipality doesn't really have any authority over it. Sarah, does the law have restrictions as it relates to hospitals, doctors' offices, senior citizen housing, Section 8 affordable housing? So, I mean, this really comes into play with medical cannabis. Article 2 of cannabis law is the area that covers medical cannabis, and it's a whole new regulatory scheme, and that has some restrictions on sales, testing, things like that. But public health law article like 13-E, again, with a prohibition on smoking, that doesn't allow smoking within certain feet of hospital entrances, things like that. Doctors' offices, this is all, I mean, these are private, doctors' offices are private property for the most part, so a municipality doesn't have any authority with respect to that. There's nothing on Section 8 affordable housing, but because the policy of the law is to allow cannabis use, you wouldn't be able to use cannabis use or past cannabis convictions as a basis for denying access to affordable housing. And I know that there's going to be a whole expungement of records related to cannabis offenses. So senior citizen housing, that's a lot of that is a county function. And again, you're not allowed to discriminate based on cannabis use. And I know that senior citizen housing, sometimes, like if you have a nursing home, I know that they have the opportunity to get a license as what's referred to as a registered user, and that would allow them to distribute medical cannabis. So like if you have a prescription for pot, basically a nursing home would be able to become a registered user for that, but that doesn't have any connection to a municipality. Does the law outline how the town or village may use the funds? Are there any restrictions on what they could use the revenue from, such as schools or public parks? No, so the revenue that's derived from any sort of pot sales, it's general revenue. The town or village could use it however they wanted to. Just to clarify my understanding of Don Henley lyrics, municipalities would be able to opt in at any point past 12/31 if they held off now, but would be unable to opt out in the future if they did opt in before. Okay, so you have to opt out. If you don't want the stuff, you have to opt out, and you have to do it before 12/31. That's the deadline. That's your only opportunity to opt out. If you decide to override that opt out, thereby essentially opting in, yeah, you can do that at any time after that, but you can never, after 12/31, there's no opportunity to opt out. You can only override your opt out, thus opting back in. Does the law, oh wait, I answered that. In your role at the Association of Towns, what are you seeing? Oh wait, somebody, I think I didn't answer the question. Somebody asked about revenue projections. There's not anything reliable that I would actually share. We'll see, right? We'll see. In your role at the Association of Towns, what are you seeing in terms of other towns and tourist destinations, and what are they doing? Are they waiting, or are they opting out? So I know that a lot of municipalities are doing exactly what the Village of Lake Placid and the town of North Elba are doing. They're holding these public informational sessions. They're holding public forums to try and get an idea of how their residents feel. Yeah, I think there haven't been too many municipalities that have officially opted out and filed their local law with the Secretary of State yet. I know a smattering of some have. With respect to tourist destinations, I would defer to, again, the village board, the town board. You guys know they know what's best for your community. My general sense is that for tourist destinations, there is more of an inclination to allow establishments within their jurisdiction. But again, that depends on, I know that there are some towns on Long Island that have beaches that are like, oh, hell no, we're not doing this. I know that the largest municipality in all of New York State, the town of, well, outside of New York City, the largest town actually in the country is the town of Hempstead, and that has a population of about 800,000. And I believe that they are looking very seriously at opting out. So really, it depends on the needs of your community. There's no one size fits all. But again, I know that most municipalities have not officially adopted an opt-out law. They are waiting, they're holding these informational sessions. And an important thing to remember is that you just have to have your local law adopted by then. You can hold your referendum after that. So you don't have to have the vote on or before December 31st, 2021, but you do have to have the local law in effect by then. Let's see. Are themed dispensaries allowed? Say a multi-sport based dispensary, like a Dave and Buster's type thing. I don't know if there are restrictions on something like that. In the village, can we get this opt-in or out? I mean, the village has the authority to adopt their own local law opting out, yes. And if the town opts out, again, it's only going to apply to the town outside village. The village gets to make its own determination.
We couldn't.
I believe somebody was asking about the November ballot, and our understanding is it's too late for the November ballot, right?
Couldn't do it.
Yeah, I have to admit, I'm not totally up on what's required. If the village board wanted to do it of its own initiative, what's required under village law, Article 9, they would have to follow. So I'm not sure what the timeframes are with respect to that.
Actually, the village doesn't have an election in November, and the town supervisor is confirming with me that it is too late for that.
Oh yeah, no, for the town, it definitely, under municipal home rule law, section 24, it's definitely too late to get it on the November ballot. Absolutely. So you would have to hold a special election. Do you see any questions that I missed, maybe?
Should we move things along at this point?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm happy to like sit here and make jokes or something, but.
Well, now we would like to hear from the public on this, but we'd like to do this in an orderly manner. So I know some of you have your cameras on, some don't. If there's anyone with their camera on that wants to raise their hand, and we're happy to hear your comments, your opinion on how you feel about this, and also state whether you live in the town or village, since it is two different entities.
Anita, before we begin that,
Sure, sorry.
I know Sarah's time was limited, and if you do have to sign off, we thank you for your contribution and informing the public and ourselves. I'm sure we'll be talking in the future.
Yeah, again, thank you for having me. I hope that it was helpful. The town can always reach out to the Association of Towns, and the village can, there's an entity, the New York Conference of Mayors, and they are outstanding as well. And Wade Beltramo there is the cannabis expert there. So we've got your towns and villages covered. So we're happy to talk. I will definitely I feel comfortable speaking on behalf of Wade here. He'd be happy to talk with you about this. So thank you for having me.
Yes, on behalf of the town, thank you. That was excellent. And if anybody is interested in sending in comments for the next 10 days, we will be accepting emails at Haley Breen's office, Development Director.
All right, I'm going to skedaddle then.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you again.
Thank you for having me. Bye-bye.
Tim Seymour wanted to talk.
Who did?
Tim, was raising his hand.
Well, he can send in his comments.
But you can make a comment if you
Tim
want.
Seymour, are you on? Would you care to make a comment? Oh, just unmute yourself. Unmute yourself. Thank you.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Wonderful. So my name's Tim Seymour. I'm the superintendent of Lake Placid Central School. I want to take a moment to just advocate regarding this issue on behalf of the youth and educators of the community. Before I do, I'd like to thank the village and the board and the town for their transparency and their willingness to engage in a pretty challenging discussion. There's a lot of viewpoints on this, and each of those viewpoints, are informed by the experiences that each person carries with them. On the school level, we've seen a rise in the use of vaporizers and discrete nicotine and THC delivery devices by our students. Providing greater access to discrete and concentrated THC products poses a threat to the mission of our school to educate our students. On-site consumption, as was discussed in the presentation, poses unique challenges to the law enforcement community. Consumption outside of the household implies a likely need for transportation to and from a consumption site. Should a person consume marijuana and leave the dispensary, what infrastructure do we have in place to prevent impaired driving? Do local and state law enforcement agents possess the tools and the training to adequately assess whether individuals are driving under the influence? And do these agencies have the capacity to address this new threat to our roads and walkways in a way that will significantly deter this behavior? Retail dispensaries pose unique challenges to schools. In addition to normalizing the use of recreational drugs, products sold in dispensaries are designed to be appealing to young adults and children. Edibles like gummies, candies, sodas, they all act as an attractive nuisance to the youth. The law limits the location of dispensaries and consumption sites to 500 feet or greater from a school, but given the walkability of large areas within the district catchment, this distance does not seem adequate or suitable to act as a meaningful deterrent in promoting the consumption of or purchase of marijuana in the community. There are numerous community centers and playgrounds in the village of Lake Placid. Each of these are family-oriented, student-oriented locations. They pose an additional boundary that I would hope the village defends and protects at all costs. We have a walkable community. I would implore our elected officials to, at a minimum, limit the location of any dispensaries to areas well beyond the walkable distance of our schools. Additionally, I would implore the town and community and the village if they decide to move forward with allowing dispensaries, I would urge that these governing bodies earmark at least half of the cut of taxable revenue to be distributed to the law enforcement community, to schools, and other prevention efforts across the community. Additionally, our municipalities have, it seems, 3 months to decide whether to opt out. If that does not occur, then they shed the ability to opt out in the future. Alternatively, if the municipalities opt out, there is always a chance to opt in well past this 3-month deadline.
Yeah.
Opting out, but keeping the option open to opt in later after this has been analyzed and scaled up across our region, across our state and our nation, seems like a wise course of action given the newness of this issue and the lack of full understanding of how well the law enforcement community can absorb this new challenge. I thank you for your time and consideration, and I appreciate it.
Thank you. Anyone else? Any other comments? Anybody from the board? Have anything?
Any callers who don't have a camera so they can't raise their hand, just want to unmute yourselves? As was stated, comments can be sent by email for the next 10 days to our Community Development Director. I believe that email is hgreen@northelba.org.
If there are no further,
See what happens.
if there are no further comments, I just thank you all for joining us and hope that you all got a better understanding of the law. Certainly, I think it was well presented and much appreciated, and appreciate everybody joining us, and thank you, and please feel free to send comments in to Haley Breen, as Anita had just said. Thank you, and with no further comments, I declare this informational session closed on behalf of the town of North Elba
In the village.
and the village of Lake Placid.
And also keep in mind, obviously, you can talk to Jay or myself or any of the village or town boards at any time. We'd love to hear what you have to say.
Thank you.
And good night.